And we are live from Data Innovation Summit 2019. I'm joined here by Doug Cutting from Cloudera, a great inventor of many technologies that you're all probably familiar with, Lucene, Hadoop, or at least you've been involved in many of those projects. And today you've had a very interesting keynote talk touching on a topic that I think a lot of data scientists and people that have a lot more influence today now have top of mind, which is ethics and the effects that their technology will have on their immediate surroundings and in society and that kind of thing. Can you give a little quick recap of the types of topics that you touched upon on stage here?
Sure, I hope it's on the top of folks' minds. I think it's beginning to get attention in broader society. People are questioning the data systems that we're using, which I think is healthy. As an industry, I think we're still very immature and we're not necessarily responding yet adequately. I think we need to make it a part of our practice, not just something that we fear a scandal, but we can actually engineer our systems to avoid scandals, to avoid violating people's rights and privacy. So we can have checklists that are considered when we design each application. And I think currently, it's not one of the concerns that people have at the outset. It's only very late that they worry about it, and we need to make it part of that process the whole time. We're at a really, I think, important moment in this. Data technologies are really taking hold in every industry and beginning to drive the majority of the decisions going forward that people are making. And so this is the time when we will standardize our processes. We'll incorporate the conventions, or develop the conventions that we'll be operating on for the next 100 or more years.
Do you imagine something like Scrum except for ethics maybe, or how
Sure, that's part of it, but I mean I think it's at the level of you know, when we started driving cars, we figured out which side of the road to drive on, where to put the steering wheel, and so on, and what the rules of the road are. I don't think we've done that as much. We've done that sort of from, we're starting to do that from an engineering point of view, but we're not concerned enough with the getting the ethical rules of the road.
A word that's popped up here many times in many of these panels has been data literacy. And so I guess you have two sides of a coin where you have an audience that needs to have a certain level of literacy with regards to numbers and statistics in order to consume what comes out from these systems. And then you have the scientists, and one of my favorite anecdotes is Richard Feynman, who after having worked on the Manhattan Project, he thought he was doing something good, and he did something good, in fact, but very much regretted having worked on it at all.
Right. And Robert Oppenheimer as well, right.
Yeah, and so how much of the responsibility falls on each half of those coins, do you think?
I mean, I think we need to own it. We're making the change. We're promoting the changes, and so we need to take responsibility. And there's a tremendous literature out there of how to incorporate ethics into your systems, from the medical domain, from the legal domain. People have been dealing with personal data on a small scale for a long time. It's just that we get all excited about the new shiny toys and what we can build, and forget all that. We haven't been trained in it. So I think it does come back to training and making it a part of the curriculum when you study. And we're starting to see this. Some of the degree programs are now making that a requirement.
Even in the social sciences and other subjects that are not necessarily
I'm thinking about in the tech. When you train a data scientist, you should train them on the ethical considerations and the approaches to doing that, and what are the you need to be looking at transparency. You need to be looking at getting consent. You need to be looking at fairness and bias, and understanding the different ways that things can be biased. How you test for that. How you institute a constant measurement to make sure that things don't shift to become biased in some way that you don't want them to, and that should be part of data science. Most of this data science isn't about weather, which maybe you don't care about if you're biased in the weather, but it's about people. And we do care if we're biased when we're building systems that talk about people.
Yeah. the Swedish curriculum has had for many years sustainability courses as obligatory courses for all of the STEM fields. And only now, many years later, do I realize how valuable that course was. It wasn't entirely evident to me back then when I took it. Perhaps an ethics course or a yeah, I suppose it should be called ethics. I'm not sure what else it would be called. Should be an obligatory part of the curriculum.
Yeah, I think it should. I think that's right. It's great to hear that they've been talking about sustainability so long in Sweden.
Yeah, and it's not just about the thing that you read in the news like global warming. It is about how to make things sustainable in a way that you can keep doing it for many years to come. So it's not about one political side or the other. It's about can we do this for a long time?
Right.
And I suppose it's sort of the same with ethics. Can we keep doing this for a long time in a way that is sustainable?
Well, I think it has to be if you look at the long term because it becomes part of your brand. Can you trust these people with your data? Can you trust your government? If people don't trust their government, it's very bad for society. It causes all sorts of corruption. And similarly, if you don't trust a business, you're not going to bring them your business. And so they need to have these very strong brands. Which with these scandals and these lack of privacy situations can really destroy that brand and trust overnight.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the great contributions of statistics has been not so much in computation and that kind of thing, but rather in sound scientific methods. What is the right way to sample? What is the right way to do this?
Yes.
If you expect a certain outcome. And perhaps we can expand the field of statistics. For an example, there's a book now called Weapons of Math Destruction that has become very popular.
Yes, I know.
And some of the examples are where people have trained models using people's decisions. And if people's decisions are bad, it's unreasonable to expect the model's decisions to be any better.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's an upside in what models can do, which is that we can retrain them, we can analyze them, we can change them. It's not always possible to do that with people. So a lot of people are very negative. Do you see more upsides than downsides in deploying these things in large scale?
I mean, I think it could go both ways, and so it's our job to try to make sure that there is more upside, right? It's I think you could easily make worse and worse systems, and we see some societies remove people's rights and sort of spiral in that direction, and we don't want ours to become that. And so I don't know that the technology itself isn't biased towards good or bad. It can be used equally well for both.
Right.
And it's a tool. I don't think it's a weapon. So I mean, some people say, is Cloudera a equivalent to an arms manufacturer? And I don't think so. I think we're much more like a hammer maker. And a hammer is mostly used for productive purposes. It can be used for destructive purposes. And we want to discourage that. We want to encourage people to use things constructively.
Right. Let's see, GDPR. You mentioned GDPR. It's been in effect now in Europe for quite a while. We haven't really seen the fallout and the nuclear fallout that a lot of people were expecting companies to get sued left and right. So let's just assume that people have prepared correctly. What is your take on the interpretability of models? Luciano Floridi and a couple of others have written on whether or not that's possible. How do you interpret that part of GDPR?
I don't know that I'm an expert enough on either GDPR or the interpretability of models to speak very cogently about that. I mean, I think we are learning.
Well, what importance is there? So you could argue that if I tell you what went into the decision-making process, that you're informed. Or you could say, well, you need to know exactly how that decision was arrived at, and that's important. I think those are the two sides that people are debating whether or not we should land on one side or the other.
I think fundamentally you need to measure the outcomes and what decisions are being made, and I think that should be part of the sort of a quality process, an audit process, and a compliance process, and understanding the internals of how it works is useful to diagnose and improve, but I don't think it particularly tells you whether you're doing things correctly. I think it could send a strong signal if you say, for example, you saw that race was a very strong feature in making the decisions internally. then that obviously would be a bad sign.
Yeah.
And one you should try to prevent, and maybe you could stop that earlier in the process and prevent it. But on the other hand, you really need to look at the output and say, is it biased in this way that we don't want it to be biased? Because there might be, we know there are other surrogates for things like race and gender and other sort of protected categories that are hard to identify what the surrogates are, and you still can get the same effect in the end.
Yeah.
And so if your postal code ends up indicating a certain thing, that may not be obvious.
Yeah. Right.
Even if you understand that postal code is the thing that the machine learning algorithm is picking out.
Yeah.
That's alone not sufficient. You need to see is it biased in a way that we don't want it to be.
I think there's potential. I personally think that there's a lot of upside to be gained because confounding variables are very difficult to get rid of in all of the sciences. But the nice thing here is that if a model is good and you want to improve it, you can pick it apart, you can start finding, and there's a lot for a bank to gain on giving more loans to more people that are worthy of having the loans by breaking this apart and getting rid of all of those systemic biases. So I think if there's profit to be made in getting rid of all these biases, perhaps that's a good incentive.
Interpretability certainly helps. It helps across the board. Helps you diagnose both quality issues and bias issues, and it just helps you improve things in general. I think treating it as a completely black box is not smart.
Are you the type that leans into the wind, or I spoke to doctors this week about using machine learning models in production, and they already have an extremely sophisticated ethical framework that I wasn't even aware of.
Oh yeah.
For instance, if my biopsy hints that I might have cancer, they're not allowed to tell me.
Right.
I didn't know that. And so the model is obviously not allowed to tell me either. And so they have many ideas that are much more mature on what's reasonable to put into production now. Do you think we're moving too fast now? Do we need to stop a little bit and solve the trolley problem and that kind of thing before we make cars that are self-driving and that kind of thing? Or are we moving at a good pace and we just need to be mindful of what's going on?
I don't want to encourage people to slow down. I just think they need to add that concern in. Because there is this tremendous history and literature in areas like medicine that there, for example, isn't in social networking. And so maybe we ought to slow down in some areas.
Right, that makes sense.
And say, but mostly we need to bring that to the table and say, when for each product decision that we make, also consider, in addition to considering performance and efficiency and accuracy, look at ethics. Is it actually the right thing to do? How are people going to respond? And we can go through checklists of is there bias? Do we have consent? There's a set of attributes. It's a well understood thing. But if you ask anybody who's building such a system, are they doing this today? No, generally not.
Yes, that's right. And I think over the long term, I believe that market forces do these types of things, but perhaps we can't afford to always wait for those long-term things, especially if we know that there are negative consequences now. And you suggested doing some kinds of regulation to help make sure that we get the positive effects sooner than later. What kind of ideas did you bring up?
So I mean GDPR is an interesting example. It took a long time to form. It has some sort of arbitrary restrictions. It's this particular thing that came out of this governance process in Europe. I'd argue it's not perfect. And all of a sudden it's applied to everyone with these great penalties, and it's this upheaval. Is that the process we'd like to see that we institute ethics across the board? Probably not. It's a big, clunky, slow, crude process. We need legislative processes as a backstop. But I think we can be more proactive as professionals within our organizations at instituting policies. So I think that you may not call it legislation, but you can call it policy, you can call it regulation. A lot of industries self-regulate. I think a lot of these things
within industries, okay,
within the industry, yes. So you'll have an independent body which audits practitioners.
Suppose medicine is a good example of
Medicine
that.
is a good example. I mean, you think of the auditing system for financial things, auditing for stock markets.
Right.
A lot of times is done by a private entity,
right.
Not by the government, that certifies that these folks are operating correctly, and if they're not, like an attorney isn't disbarred by the state.
Yeah.
Attorneys are disbarred by other attorneys.
Right.
And so we ought to be helping each other to regulate, because we can operate much more rapidly. We know the technology better. We can figure out what are the things that are going to build trust and help both society and help industry much better than I think whoever it was that crafted GDPR can.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say I just slam politicians and so on, but it's a different approach.
Yeah.
And I think we can do better in many cases if we take things into our own hands. But we need to be proactive. Right now, I think everyone is sort of thinking, what can we get away with? How much can we, we sneak by the user and sneak by the government, and that's a terrible approach.
Yeah.
That's going to backfire, and it is backfiring.
Well, one of my favorite examples of self-regulation is in Singapore. Every restaurant gets a nice letter on the outside of how hygienic they are, and then it's up to you to decide which restaurant to go to. And we all know that some of those street food vendors taste really good.
Right.
If you want to go there, you can, but it's up to you.
Right, right.
But we're seeing a couple of places where things are being regulated. I saw in the US there were some suggestions that social media platforms should be treated as utilities. And then we're seeing things that are a bit more internal, where companies are moving forward and trying to be open with their data, open with their algorithms and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in your mind, you think that it should be more grassroots in a sense?
I think we can operate more quickly and more effectively if we do it grassroots.
Right.
And that if we wait for legislative things that will end up with sort of ham-fisted, crude approaches that we won't like. And the more we can be proactive, the more that the law can just form a backstop. We can have a simple law saying, certain things are illegal, and in general, we trust this industry. There's a lot of things are, just conventions in society that we assume people aren't going to be horrible actors. And mostly they aren't. And so we need those kind of restraints, social restraints in technology and institutionalize them. And it's moving so quickly that we just haven't done that. So we need to start doing it.
I think everybody thinks that they themselves are the good guy. As long as I'm doing this, it's okay. We just don't want the bad guy to get a hold of this technology. And it could have such a good effect for society as long as, because I'm not going to do anything bad with it.
Right.
Unless that person I don't like, something like that. How can we help foster these technologies that, because there's a scalability aspect now. I think that's one of the things that AI and big data can do is scale to entire societies.
Yep.
How can we foster these technologies that have potentially extremely good effects on society, but people have this mindset of, it's okay because I'm the good guy?
Yeah, I think we just need to be mindful and watchful and not, not just assume that everything's going to be utopian, that we are only doing good things, and have a little self-doubt. And I think there's been a distinct lack of that, and continues to be.
There was a recent publication by OpenAI where they had not released a model that could write fake articles.
Yes.
Is that this type of thing?
Yes, I think that's wonderful. That's showing that sort of restraint. And I think in social networks, it's a shame that we had to wait till we're seeing elections being tilted and things like that, and the things being perverted by foreign powers and all these kinds of things before they started reining in all this false information. There's still huge amounts of false information on there, and these are private systems. There's no obligation to relay everything that's false. They can say this is clearly not only false but bad information, that it's encouraging bad behavior.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be hosting that.
I think it takes a lot of integrity, and it might be scary business-wise to take a stand.
I think you're probably right. I think it's easier to say we're just a dumb pipe, but they're clearly not.
But I think there's also a lot to gain. There are a lot of people you can look up to that try to do what's right and try to do what's best and that kind of thing. there's as much to gain on one side as the other.
You've seen recently YouTube has altered its algorithm for what videos they propose to watch next because they realized that was, and I think this was done fairly voluntarily by the people who were working on that team, realized that they were encouraging certain patterns and destroying some people's lives because they were inadvertently encouraging these paths towards this sort of some terrible information.
Yeah.
And they figured out a way to hopefully improve their algorithm so there'll be less of that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a positive step.
Yeah.
Of someone being reflective and seeing the harm and fixing things before anyone made them.
Well, one of the reasons I became an engineer was to try and make the world a better place through science. And I think a nice way of doing that is to ask yourself what you can do first and foremost, instead of asking what others can do for you.
Right,
and I think that's a little bit the message you're trying to send here.
Yeah, I think it's just having some self-doubt, thinking about others, and not assuming that everything you do is wonderful and flawless. Is certainly a good start.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. That was our tech update with Doug Cutting.